very important voice in the history of talk radio and in the sounds that you want to hear about common sense is Dr. Benny Peiser. He's director of the Global Warming Policy Forum, because we were talking just now about how Laura says, we'll all be eating insects in 25 years because people want us to stop eating meat because it's going to save the planet. Well, really? Is it? I'm not so sure. And today we've got Sir Kier Starmer saying that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is missing in action over the climate crisis. He accuses him of delivering a cabaret of sound bites. This is pretty good coming from Sir Kier Starmer, the man who, as I always say, can't walk past a fence without sitting on it. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Dr. Benny, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Thank you very much for joining us in the home of common sense, because I feel as though there's an ever-diminishing circle of us who are still left standing on the ever-decreasing iceberg of common sense, as all of these maniacs swim around us, telling us terrible things are going to come down the pipe if we don't do something which we can't really do.
Well, Kier Starmer has a point, and the point he has is that Boris is in a pickle. Boris is in trouble because his UN climate summit in Glasgow, which his green advisors promised him would be a kind of repeat of the London Olympics, some kind of crowning event, looks increasingly like a flop.
Yes.
And the reason is not so much that he has got lost in action. It is more that his advisors completely misread the international situation. So India, China, 85 nations have failed to submit their emissions targets that were supposed to be submitted a few days ago. These are UN deadlines according to the Paris Agreement. There's a clear sense that the UK and the US are simply not getting where they want to be, and that most of the developing world, who are now calling for hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, are simply not going to sign up to anything where they will be faced with some penalty. So Boris is in trouble. He has been totally misadvised, and he now needs plan B to make sure that this COP26 in Glasgow doesn't end as a complete and utter fiasco.
Yes. Well, I guess maybe his first mistake was not hiring somebody to organise the opening ceremony for him, because if he'd done that, perhaps it would have been a bit more like the Olympics, and everybody would have gone, oh, look, isn't Britain great? Look at this fantastic sort of episode of chicanery that we're watching. But the bottom line for me is that the whole point of these climate conferences seems to me to be flawed in the first place, because all they're really trying to achieve is a mission statement which says this is what we're planning to do, and then they call that a success. But all they've got from the Paris Agreement is a load of countries saying we will guarantee or we will strive to reach this level of carbon emissions by this date. It means nothing, really, does it?
Absolutely. Well, the whole point is we've had these meetings for roughly 30 years. That's why it's called COP26. It's a 26th meeting. And ever since they've met, CO2 emissions continue to go up. And the reason is quite simple. Despite all the claims by ministers and green lobbyists that renewable energy is cheap and competitive and now cheaper than coal and so on, despite all these claims, most of the world is still using fossil fuels simply because these are the cheapest forms of energy. 30 years ago, 80% of the global energy mix was based on fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. And today, it's still 80%, primarily because the developing world is developing and they're using the cheapest energy they have. So that has always been the dilemma of the whole climate agenda, that the reality of the energy demand and energy need in the developing world has been underestimated.
Yes. And that would appear to be an ongoing problem, because as much as the government wants us to change things, the change is going to come very, very slowly. I was speaking to a caller earlier who happens to be a gas engineer, and he was talking about the ludicrous suggestion of how so few people in this country would be able to change the way they put heating into their homes, particularly if they were supposed to be using this underfloor heating system, which requires massive space for, he said, a sort of fridge freezer style unit, which has to sit somewhere inside the house. And then you must have outside room to be able to put things in quite a big garden. So 50 to 60% of people who live in this country couldn't do any of that.
Absolutely, which is why this promise by Boris to install 600,000 heat pumps every year in the next few years is simply not going to happen. This he has already conceded and has now kicked this whole idea of ripping out or banning gas boilers far into the future when he will long be retired, perhaps almost forgotten. So clearly, all these net zero policies that he is proposing are extremely expensive, are toxic, are politically, in my view, unsustainable. And that is why Kier Starmer realizes that Boris has dug himself into this deep hole, and he has to start thinking about how to get out of this dilemma and not be completely humiliated at the end of the year when it becomes clear that he won't be able to deliver a net zero agreement at Glasgow.
No, of course. I mean, the problem, of course, for Starmer, though, is that he doesn't provide any alternative ideas. He doesn't have any ideas, so therefore he can just criticise Boris Johnson for a lack of leadership, while his leadership skills are even worse.
Well, that's the role of an opposition leader, to criticise the government. That's what he's doing. You're absolutely right. Kier Starmer hasn't got really an alternative. He's basically saying, Boris isn't, quick enough, or he's lost in action. He's not doing enough. That misses the point. The point is, no matter what a UK government does, whether it's Labour or Conservative, it does not matter in terms of global CO2 emissions, because in the next 30, 40 years, the most emissions will be emitted in the developing world, in the rising countries in Asia who are competing with us, who are overtaking us, who are producing all the products that we consume. We think we are good because we emit less CO2. Well, we've done that by simply asking China, India, and the rest of Asia to manufacture the products we consume.
Yes.
And then we would say, oh, we are the Greens. Yeah, but we are losing all the industry and all the manufacturing.
Right. Well, China must be laughing their socks off at the UK and the rest of the European Union as well, and Joe Biden in the United States, who seems to think that people in America are going to give up their cars. He obviously hasn't taken a look around very much, particularly in very, very busy parts of California, as I always quote, where there's 16-lane highways which are consistently jammed with traffic because people like their cars. And guess why? There isn't any other form of transport in America that works.
Well, and interestingly, you mentioned California. There were recent reports that a third of all buyers of electric cars in recent years, I think the last 5 years, a third have switched back to petrol because of the inconvenience of electric cars. Right. Because they are inconvenient.
Yes. Well, of course they are.
And they're more expensive. They're more expensive. And it takes, I think Switch has mentioned, it takes 6 to 8 years to pay back the extra cost. And given that electricity prices are going to rise very fast if net zero were to be implemented, then of course electric cars are basically unsustainable and unaffordable for most people because they couldn't pay the electricity that is needed to charge them.
Exactly right. And not every electric charge will be free. I understand if you buy a Tesla, you can charge your car for free, but that's because you're spending 75 grand on the car. But if you're buying a Nissan Leaf, you have to pay for the electricity. And I know it might be cheaper. It might be cheaper than petrol, but also the government will no longer have 40 billion in taxes plus all the petrol tax they collect.
Don't worry, don't worry, they will get that money back.
Oh, I'm sure. But then in order to get that money back, they'll have to charge road tax for electric cars.
Of course. Every second you're in the car, you'll have to pay. For every second you drive, you will have to pay.
And so, I mean, the question I suppose that I can't get anybody else to answer, and I'll give you the opportunity to give it a try. Why are the governments so obsessed with this issue?
Well, that is a very good question. Of course, there is huge the media has gone bonkers.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the media loves kind of scare stories and disasters and so on. But there is huge pressure coming from two sectors of our society. One is the university sector. The scientists have come together in a big way and forming kind of activist campaigns on net zero, on climate. So you hear all the time scientists saying we're not doing enough, we have to do it. They obviously have no understanding of international relations, of energy costs, of energy policy. They don't understand that. They only see the climate issue. And then you have, of course, the media who are hyping up this to an incredible event, almost 24/7. And of course, governments are put under pressure, enormous pressure, to show that they have to do something. But we are now getting to the point where the low-hanging fruit, the easy bits have been done, and now it's getting really, really difficult, very expensive, and very unpopular.
And as you say, Kier Starmer, if he's getting anything right, is pointing to where's the result coming from, and it doesn't look as if there is a result, because if the only result you're going to get in the short term is a commitment from somebody to do something, it's not even worth the paper it's not written on.
No, absolutely. And as I said, Britain is claiming that they are so successful in decarbonizing. Part of the reason is that we've simply shifted a lot of production of things we consume to other countries, where they produce, of course, the CO2. So if you take into consideration all the CO2 that has been emitted as a result of the products that were produced for consumers here in the UK, it would look quite differently. But the main point is there is this hysteria, collective hysteria in many institutions, the scientific institutions, the universities, and the media, who are putting the pressure on governments, not just in UK, all over the Western. It's mainly a Western issue. Let's face it.
Yeah.
This is mainly a thing in wealthy countries where people have the luxury to be concerned about these things.
Right, it's absolutely right. You couldn't have put it better. Dr. Benny Peiser, as ever, talking great sense to us, of course. He's from the Global Warming Policy Forum, one of the few sensible organisations that studies climate change and actually comes up with proper ideas as to what we do about it. Because quite frankly, there isn't really any point in having this Glasgow summit. I mean, even Allegra Stratton, who's the woman supposedly the spokesperson for the summit, knows that she's barking up the wrong tree. She knows that she's talking a load of old nonsense. She knows that by driving a diesel car, because it's more economical and it makes more sense, she can't possibly be anything other than a hypocrite, can she?